The rain in Manhattan didn't fall. It assaulted. It turned the neon glow of Times Square into a smeared, psychedelic nightmare and transformed the sleek glass facade of the Thorne and Associates law firm into a weeping fortress. Inside his 45th floor office, Elias Thorne sat amidst the silence of success. His desk was a desert of polished mahogany, save for a single jarring anomaly, a heavy black envelope sealed with charcoal-colored wax. The seal bore the imprint of an owl with its wings outstretched, the sigil of a family he had spent his entire adult life trying to forget. Elias had been a Thorne, in name only for 15 years. He had traded the suffocating mist of the Appalachian Mountains for the rigid certainties of contract law and high-stakes litigation. He liked things that could be proven, argued, and settled. He liked things that lived on paper, not in the shadows of ancient oak trees. With a silver letter opener, he broke the seal. The wax crumbled like dried blood. Elias, the elegant, spidery script began. Your grandmother, Abigail Thorne, has returned to the earth. You are the sole remaining branch of our withered tree. The hollows and all the legacy therein now belong to you. But a Thorne does not inherit through blood alone. You must earn your place by the hearth. 7 nights, Elias. Stay for 7 nights, and the world is yours. Leave early, and you leave with nothing but the dust on your shoes. It was signed by Silas, the man who had served as his grandmother's shadow for as long as Elias could remember. Elias let out a sharp, cynical breath. He didn't need the money, his billable hours were astronomical, and hung, but there was a predatory instinct in him that couldn't let a prize that large simply vanish. The Thorne estate wasn't just a house, it was thousands of acres of timberland and coal deposits. It was a kingdom. 7 nights. Elias whispered to the empty office. I can survive a week in the middle of nowhere for a kingdom. The drive to Blackwood, West Virginia, took 10 hours, each mile stripping away the modern world. By the time he crossed the state line, the skyscrapers had been replaced by jagged, forest-cloaked ridges that seemed to lean over the road, whispering to one another. The air turned heavy, smelling of damp soil and wood smoke. He reached the gates of the hollows just as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting the valley into a premature, bruised purple twilight. The mansion was a Victorian monstrosity, a jagged silhouette of gables and turrets perched on the edge of a steep ravine. It looked less like a home, and more like a tomb designed by someone who hated the living. The gates groaned open without a visible hand touching them. Elias drove up the winding gravel path, his headlights cutting through a fog so thick it felt like driving through wool. Standing on the porch was Silas. He looked exactly as Elias remembered, which was impossible. 15 years should have bent his back or grayed his hair, but he remained a pillar of iron and wrinkled skin. He held a dim lantern that cast long, dancing shadows across his hollow cheeks. You arrived on the cusp of the dark, Master Elias, Silas said, his voice like the grinding of stones. A precarious time. Save the theatrics, Silas, Elias said, hauling his expensive leather suitcase from the trunk. I'm here for the week. Show me to my room so I can get this over with. Silas didn't move immediately. He looked at Elias with eyes that seemed to lack pupils. There are rules in this house, established by your grandmother to keep the peace. The most important is this: we do not look into ourselves here. Elias frowned. What is that supposed to mean? The mirrors, Silas replied, turning to lead the way inside. You will find them unavailable. Do not seek them out. In the hollows, we do not look at the world. We let the world look at us. As Elias stepped into the grand foyer, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air settled into his bones. The house was cavernous, draped in heavy velvet curtains and smelling of cedar and something sickly sweet, like overripe lilies. But Silas was right. Every mirror in the hallway was gone. In their places were pale, rectangular patches on the wallpaper where the glass had once hung. The few reflective surfaces that remained, the glass panes of the grandfather clock, the polished silver tea sets, the windows, had been painted over with thick, matte black lacquer. Elias was left with no reflection. He was a ghost in his own inheritance, moving through a house that refused to show him his own face. Your room is at the top of the east wing, Silas said, handing him a tarnished brass key. Dinner is at 8. Do not wander after the lanterns are extinguished. The dust here has a memory, Elias. Try not to stir it. Elias watched the old man disappear into the shadows of the servants' quarters. He looked at the key in his hand, then at the black lacquered window nearby. He saw nothing but a void where his image should be. The first night had begun. The first night in the East Wing was an exercise in sensory deprivation. Elias lay atop the heavy down mattress, but sleep was a fleeting ghost. Without the city's constant hum, the silence of the hollows was deafening, a thick, pressurized stillness that seemed to vibrate against his eardrums. Every few minutes, the house would groan, the ancient floorboards expanding and contracting like the chest of a sleeping giant. When morning arrived, the fog hadn't lifted. It had merely turned a sickly, translucent white. Elias spent the fourth day attempting to map the sprawling estate. As a man of logic, he sought to rationalize the lack of mirrors. Perhaps it was a religious mania, he thought, or some eccentricity of Abigail's dementia. But as he walked the corridors, he noticed that the black lacquer on the windows wasn't just paint. It was etched with tiny, microscopic symbols, runes that seemed to squirm if he looked at them for too long. By late afternoon, the boredom began to warp into a gnawing unease. He found himself in the grand library, a circular room where the books were bound in skin-cold vellum. In the center of the room sat a massive, draped object. It was the size of a man. Elias stepped toward it. The velvet cover was thick with the memory dust Silas had warned him about. Driven by a sudden, defiant impulse, Elias grabbed the corner of the fabric. "I wouldn't do that, Master Elias." Elias jumped, his heart hammering. Silas was standing in the shadows of the doorway, his presence so silent he might as well have been part of the architecture. "You have a habit of appearing out of nowhere, Silas," Elias snapped, trying to hide his shaking hands. "What is under this cloth?" "A mistake," Silas replied flatly. "Your grandfather was a man who looked too deep into things. He wanted to see the soul behind the skin. This house is a cage for the things he saw. If you uncover that surface, you invite them to see you back." "I don't believe in ghosts, Silas. And I certainly don't believe in sentient furniture." "Belief is a luxury of the sunlit world," Silas said, stepping forward, his lantern flickering. "Here, there are only debts and the collectors. Dinner is served." Dinner was a grim affair. A single plate of venison and bitter greens sat at the end of a table meant for 20. Silas stood behind Elias, unmoving, watching him eat. The atmosphere was so heavy that Elias felt as if he were swallowing lead. "Where is the rest of the staff?" Elias asked, his voice echoing in the vaulted hall. "They moved into the walls long ago," Silas whispered. Elias stopped chewing. He looked at the wood-paneled walls. For a second, he thought he saw the grain of the wood shift, forming the shape of a screaming mouth before settling back into a knot. He pushed his plate away, the appetite vanishing instantly. That night, the scratching began. It started at midnight, a rhythmic scritch coming from the interior of the wall behind his headboard. It wasn't the frantic scuttle of a rodent. It was deliberate, methodical, like a human fingernail dragging across dry timber. Elias sat up, clicking on his flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The scratching stopped. "Who's there?" Elias demanded. From the other side of the wood, a voice drifted through. It was thin, like wind whistling through a cracked reed. It didn't come from a throat. It sounded like the house itself was vibrating. "Elias. Elias Thorne. Open the gate." "Go away," Elias whispered, clutching the covers. "We are so cold, Elias. Give us your breath. Your grandmother promised us a thorn. Give us back our faces." Then came the thud. Something heavy slammed against the wall from the inside, hard enough to crack the plaster. Elias scrambled out of bed, his logic failing him, replaced by a primal, ancestral terror. He ran for the door, but it was locked from the outside. He spun around, sweeping his flashlight across the room. The pale patches on the walls, where the mirrors used to be, seemed to be glowing with a faint, bioluminescent light. The scratching moved. It was under the floorboards now. Elias backed into the corner, his eyes fixed on the heavy wardrobe. He realized then that the scratching wasn't trying to get into the room. It was trying to draw him out. Through the keyhole of the east wing door, he saw a sliver of the hallway. A figure was passing by. It was tall, draped in a soft silver blue gown. The exact color of the sky just before evening. "Grandmother," he gasped. The figure paused. It turned toward the door. Elias pressed his eye to the keyhole, but he saw no face. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface of gray skin, like a mirror that had forgotten how to reflect. The figure didn't speak. It simply pointed toward the grand library. Elias collapsed against the door as the scratching intensified, now coming from every wall at once. He realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't just waiting out a week. He was being seasoned. The house was stripping away his Manhattan armor, piece by piece, until nothing was left but a thorn, ready to be consumed. The scratching didn't stop until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the black lacquered windows. Elias had spent the remainder of the night huddled in the corner of his room, clutching a heavy brass lamp as if it were a talisman against the abyss. When Silas finally unlocked the door at 7 a.m., the old man looked down at Elias with a chilling lack of surprise. "The air in the east wing is thin," Silas remarked, his voice as dry as the dust he worshipped. "It makes the mind wander to dark places." "It wasn't my mind," Elias hissed, standing up with trembling legs. "Something was in the walls. And I saw a woman. In a silver gown. She had no face, Silas." Silas began to strip the bedsheets, his movements robotic. "The Thorne lineage has always had trouble with its image. We are a family of collectors, Elias. But eventually, the collection starts to collect us. Your grandmother is merely checking the quality of the new arrival." Elias pushed past him, driven by a desperate need for answers that didn't involve riddles or folklore. He headed straight for the grand library. The tall, faceless figure he had seen through the keyhole had pointed there, and in the cold light of day, his lawyer's brain demanded evidence. The library was even more oppressive than the night before. The circular walls of books seemed to be closing in, the smell of rotting paper and lilies thick enough to taste. In the center, the man-sized object remained under its heavy velvet shroud. Elias approached it. He remembered Silas's warning. If you uncover that surface, you invite them to see you back. But Elias was a man who lived by the rule of discovery. He reached out and with a violent yank, tore the velvet away. He didn't find a monster. He found a mirror. It was a massive, floor-standing mirror framed in tarnished bronze. The metal was etched with the same squirming runes he had seen on the windows. But the glass was wrong. It wasn't silvered or clear. It was a deep swirling amber, like liquid honey frozen in time. Elias stood before it, expecting to see his disheveled reflection. Instead he saw the library, but it was different. In the mirror's world, the books were burning with cold blue flames, and the air was filled with drifting black ash. Then he saw them. Behind his amber-tinted reflection stood dozens of figures. They were hawk-hack gaunt, their skin the color of wet parchment, their eyes replaced by hollow black pits. They were dressed in the rags of 19th-century laborers, the miners and loggers who had built the Thorne fortune with their blood. They weren't just standing there. They were leaning toward Elias, their hands pressing against the surface of the glass from the other side. The bronze frame began to vibrate, a low hum that shook Elias's teeth. "Elias." The voice from the walls returned, but now it was a chorus of 1,000 whispers. "The price is overdue. Abigail cannot hold the gate alone." In the center of the crowd in the mirror, the faceless woman in the silver blue gown appeared. She glided through the spirits, and as she touched the glass, the amber surface began to ripple like water. A single long, pale finger emerged from the mirror, reaching for Elias's throat. Elias stumbled back, knocking over a stack of vellum books. "It's a trick," he gasped. "A hologram. A hallucination." "It is a ledger, Elias," Silas's voice boomed from the doorway. He was no longer the subservient butler. He stood tall, his lantern burning with a fierce, unnatural green light. "Your grandfather made a pact with the earth, the wealth of the mountains in exchange for the light of his workers. Every soul that died in a Thorne mine didn't go to heaven or hell. They were stored here in the Bronze Gate, to power the Thorne legacy." Silas stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on the mirror. "But a battery needs a casing. Abigail was the vessel for 40 years. She held the weight of 1,000 stolen lives within her own skin. Now she is exhausted. The gate is cracking." Elias looked at the mirror. Cracks were indeed spreading across the amber glass, and from those fissures, a thick black smoke began to leak. It smelled of coal dust and ancient, stagnant air. The 7 nights, Elias realized, his heart turning to ice. It's not a test of character. No, Silas smiled, revealing rows of sharpened, yellowed teeth. It is a process of refinement. The house is draining you, Elias, emptying your soul so that it can be filled with the collection. By the 7th night, you won't be Elias Thorne of New York anymore. You will be the new gatekeeper. You will be the vessel that holds the Thorne darkness for the next century. The faceless woman in the mirror, his grandmother, pressed her entire palm against the glass. The hum turned into a shriek. I'm leaving, Elias shouted, turning to run. The forest won't let you, Silas called after him. The trees are part of the ledger too. You are home now, Elias. And a Thorne always pays his debts. Elias bolted from the library, but as he reached the foyer he looked at the black-painted windows. The paint was peeling, and behind the glass, thousands of faceless eyes were staring in, waiting for the sun to go down for the 6th time. Night 6 descended upon Blackwood not as a sunset, but as an encroaching ink blot that smothered the valley. Elias Thorne stood in the driveway, his fingers white-knuckled around the steering wheel of his Audi. He hammered the ignition button, but the engine only emitted a wet, choked click. Through the windshield, the fog had coalesced into something semi-solid, swirling with the phantom shapes of reaching hands. The trees at the edge of the property had moved, he was sure of it. They stood closer now, their skeletal branches interlaced like a ribcage, barring the path back to the civilized world. Panic is a chaotic emotion, Elias. It lacks the precision of the law. The voice came from the passenger seat. Elias shrieked, bolting backward against the driver's side door. Silas was sitting there, shrouded in a coat that seemed woven from grave dirt and moth wings. He held a silver tray, and upon it lay a single, ivory-white card. Get out! Get out of my car! Elias screamed, his high-priced education failing to provide a more sophisticated defense. Silas didn't move. He held out the tray. The invitation for the final transition. Your presence is required in the dining hall. Elias looked at the card. In spidery, embossed lettering, it read, Elias Thorne, the final vessel. My grandmother is dead, Silas. I watched them bury the casket. Elias gasped, his breath hitching. We buried a shell of meat and bone, Silas whispered, leaning closer. The smell of stagnant coal mines rolled off him. But the Thorne legacy is an appetite, Elias. It needs a fresh house to live in. Abigail is waiting. She has grown impatient with the amber glass. Forcefully, Silas grabbed Elias's wrist. The old man's grip felt like a cold iron shackle. With a strength that defied his withered frame, he dragged Elias from the car. The gravel beneath Elias's shoes felt like shifting teeth. He was hauled back into the foyer, where the black paint on the windows was now sloughing off in great, wet sheets, revealing the 1,000 gaunt faces outside, their foreheads pressed against the glass, watching the succession. The house had transformed. The air was thick with drifting soot and the taste of metallic blood. In the dining hall, the long table had been cleared of food. Instead, it was covered in hundreds of flickering candles made of gray tallow. At the head of the table sat the faceless woman in the silver-blue gown. She was no longer a reflection. She was solid, leaning forward, her smooth, featureless head tilted as if studying Elias's fear. Sit, Silas commanded, pushing Elias into the chair at the opposite end. Elias looked down at the table. A shallow bronze bowl sat before him, filled with a thick, dark liquid that shimmered like the amber glass of the mirror. The process of emptying has begun, Silas said, walking behind Elias. He began to chant in a language that sounded like the crushing of shale and the snapping of bone. Elias tried to stand, but his muscles felt like they had turned to water. He was emptying. His memories of New York, his knowledge of the law, his very sense of self were being siphoned away by the oppressive weight of the house. He looked at his hands. They were becoming translucent, the skin turning the color of ash. Abigail held the light for 40 years, Silas intoned, his green lantern casting a sickly halo over the faceless woman. She took the screams of the miners and the grief of the widows and wore them as a mask. Now she passes the mask to you. The faceless figure stood. As she walked toward Elias, the candles flickered and died, leaving only the green glow of Silas's lantern. With every step she took, her silver gown turned to black soot, falling away to reveal a body that was a tapestry of scars and coal dust veins. She reached Elias and placed her cold, smooth palms against his cheeks. Elias tried to scream, but no sound came out. He felt a cold, oily pressure entering his ears, his nose, his mouth. The collection, the thousands of stolen souls trapped in the bronze gate, were pouring into him, seeking a new home in his young, hollowed-out spirit. "The debt is paid," Silas hissed, his voice filled with a terrible, religious ecstasy. The thorn tree blooms once more in the dark. Elias's vision began to blur into amber. He saw the library, the bronze gate, and the miners reaching out. He felt his face beginning to smooth over, his features melting into the featureless void of the gatekeeper. But as the last of his New York life flickered in his mind, he saw a glint of metal on the table. The silver letter opener he had tucked into his pocket back in Manhattan. A thorn inherited through blood. Elias realized then that if he couldn't leave, he would ensure there was no vessel left to fill. The amber pressure was absolute. It felt as though Elias's lungs were being packed with wet coal dust, and his mind was a chalkboard being erased by a jagged stone. The featureless woman, the entity that was once Abigail Thorne, pressed her palms harder against his face, her cold skin beginning to fuse with his own. Silas's chanting reached a deafening crescendo, the room spinning in a nauseating whirl of green lantern light and absolute shadow. Elias's fingers, trembling and pale, brushed against the silver letter opener in his pocket. It was a cold, sharp reminder of the world he belonged to, a world of iron, logic, and decisive action. With the last ounce of his siphoning strength, Elias didn't aim for the faceless woman. He knew now that she was merely a byproduct of the gate. He threw his weight backward, toppling the heavy mahogany chair, and breaking her hold. He scrambled across the floor, not toward the exit but toward the grand library. "Master Elias, the cycle must be completed," Silas roared, his voice sounding like a mountain collapsing. The old man lunged, his fingers elongating into talons of shadow. Elias burst into the library. The massive bronze-framed mirror was glowing with a terrifying, incandescent heat. The thousands of gaunt faces within the glass were no longer leaning. They were screaming, their silent wails vibrating the very foundations of the hollows. The liquid amber surface was bulging outward, a blister of stolen time ready to burst. Elias gripped the silver letter opener. He remembered his grandfather's journals. "Blood is the ink of the ledger. You want a thorn?" Elias shouted, his voice cracking. "Then take the whole legacy." He didn't stab the mirror. Instead, he slashed the blade across his own palm. As the crimson blood welled up, he stepped forward and slammed his bleeding hand directly onto the swiveling runes of the bronze frame. The effect was instantaneous. The runes, fueled by the fresh, living blood of the soul heir, began to spin in reverse. The green light of Silas's lantern turned a violent, scorching red. "No!" Silas screamed, reaching the threshold of the library. Behind him, the faceless woman began to dissolve into a cloud of fine, black ash. "You are breaking the contract. You will destroy us all." "That's the point, Silas," Elias hissed, the pain in his hand grounding him in reality. "I'm liquidating the firm." With a roar of defiance, Elias used his uninjured hand to grab a heavy bronze bust from a nearby pedestal, and hurled it with all his might at the center of the amber glass. The mirror didn't just break, it detonated. A shockwave of cold air and ancient, trapped screams erupted from the glass. Thousands of shards of amber flew through the air like glowing shrapnel. The black smoke that had been leaking from the fissures was suddenly sucked back in, followed by the souls of the miners, the loggers, and the widows. They weren't being imprisoned again. They were being unleashed. The spirits didn't flee. They turned. Silas was the first to be taken. The gnarled, shadowy hands of 100 miners rose from the floorboards, dragging him down into the depths of the ravine below the house. His green lantern shattered, and as the flame died, so did his unnatural life. The faceless woman in the silver gown flickered one last time, her head tilting in what looked like a nod of gratitude, before she vanished into a swirl of soot. Elias grabbed a fallen candle and struck a match. The memory dust in the air was highly flammable, a century of accumulated coal residue and dry paper. He dropped the match onto the velvet shroud. The fire climbed the curtains in seconds. Elias ran. He burst through the foyer just as the front doors were kicked open from the inside by the force of the spirits escaping. He didn't look at the windows. He didn't look at the faces. He sprinted for his car. As he reached the driveway, the Audi's engine roared to life. The curse on the machinery broke in along with the mirror. Elias slammed the car into gear and floored it, the tires spitting gravel. In his rearview mirror, the hollows was a pyre. The jagged turrets and gables were engulfed in orange and blue flames, reaching toward the Appalachian sky. As the roof collapsed into the ravine, a massive pillar of black ash rose, forming the brief, flickering shape of an owl before being scattered by the mountain wind. Epilogue. Elias Thorne returned to New York, but he never stepped foot in the 45th floor office again. He settled his affairs, donated his remaining Thorne funds to a miners' respiratory health foundation, and moved to a small, sun-drenched apartment in Brooklyn. His home is filled with light. There are no heavy curtains, no cedar chests, and no velvet shrouds. But Elias Thorne still has one rule. He never buys mirrors. Sometimes, when he walks past the dark windows of a subway car, or the polished chrome of a passing truck, he catches a glimpse of a reflection that isn't quite his. It's a man with silver blue eyes and a palm that never quite stops scarring. And behind him, for just a fraction of a second, he sees 1,000 gaunt faces mim coy smiling, in the dark. The debt was settled in ash, but the dust never truly settles.